The proceeding will start.
Order. Welcome to this morning's session of the Business and Trade Select Committee, where I'm delighted we're joined by three excellent witnesses on our first panel to discuss the future of UK trade policy as part of our inquiry into export-led growth. Lord Frost, perhaps I could begin with you. Are you pleased with the way trade has progressed since Brexit?
Well, yes, I think is the short answer, because I think all those who predicted a dramatic change in our trade and a dramatic turn for the worse have been proved wrong.
Do you now have the lowest trade openness in the G7?
Well, we always have had relatively low trade openness because of the size of our economy and structural factors. The issue is how much has it changed as a result of Brexit, and it hasn't really changed significantly at all.
I'm looking at this excellent report from UK and Changing Europe. I don't know what you make of them. They seem a pretty good crowd to me. But their last trade monitor shows that trade openness has fallen to levels last seen in 2017. That doesn't sound like a roaring success.
Well, these levels fluctuate up and down, and I repeat, the issue is not trade openness. The issue is, has there been the kind of significant change in trade levels that's been predicted by so many, including UK and Changing Europe, and so far all those people have been proved wrong.
If we look at, say, for example, goods exports to Europe, and we'll spend a bit of time on goods exports today, I think. So between 2014 and 2018, goods exports were growing at nearly 3%, about 2.9%. And obviously, if goods exports had carried on growing at that level from, say, 2021, would have had about £54 billion worth of extra exports of goods into Europe. That would seem to outweigh the gains that have been listed against the free trade agreements, which, looking across Japan, Australia, New Zealand, CPTPP, it's about 784 million. So that's an order of magnitude lower than what our goods exports may have been if goods exports carried on growing at the rates before Brexit.
Well, I think we've all learned in the last few years about the risks of simple extrapolation from previous trends, and your base period is one when we were still coming out of the financial crash. These figures are all extremely sensitive to the base years that you choose. I repeat, I would say, and to be clear on this, I think there has been a very small effect from leaving the single market and the customs union to our goods trade, maybe 2%, maybe 3%, but services trade has gone up hugely. Let's not forget that's about half of our trade. And secondly, trade and growth are not the same things. And I would disagree with those who say there's a mechanical relationship between openness, between exports, between trade levels and growth. And I think the last few years have borne that out.
In the Telegraph yesterday, you listed, together with Mr. Jenrick, a series of largely supply-side reforms that you thought were available now to us. If we push those through, do you think actually that would capitalise on the freedoms that we do now have outside the EU?
I do, and as I said, my view is always that there was a very slight hit to leaving the single market and customs union, but that should be well compensated for by the ability to do structural reforms in the domestic sector. Now, unfortunately, we haven't done as many of those as I would wish, but if you look at our productivity and growth record over the last couple of decades, it's got gradually worse. That's because our domestic economy has been furring up the arteries, and we need to liberalise, we need to reform, we need to do a lot of things to bring growth back. That's now in our hands.
So it's quite a long list of things that you mentioned in the article. Are there particular things that you would put at the top of your list?
Well, where to start? And of course, a lot of these things have a mix of what would have been purely domestic policy and EU policy. I would certainly put the current version of net zero and high energy costs at the top of that list. I would want to see a lot more house building and changing to planning regulation. I think we need more broadly to change our economic model so it's less reliant on immigration. And of course, we need to get tax and spending down because there's no future for the country as a high tax, high spend social democrat economy.
So I think the language you use is suffocating red tape around nuclear and gas power stations, cut hefty renewables and get energy prices down to bring manufacturing back. That's something that you think is more possible outside the EU than inside.
Well, I do, because, as I said, a lot of these things have a mix of domestic and EU competence in old terms. Employment law, environment law, planning law, all of those are influenced by EU regulations and doctrines, as well as by the way we do things here domestically. And now we can do all those things, and we should be doing them.
The other thing that you flag is the opportunity to cut tariffs lower in order to get food prices down, as your line of argument. Are you happy with the pace at which we have signed free trade agreements? We've got 4 done, basically, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, CPTPP, in the period since we left Brexit. Is that a good track record, or actually do you think we could have gone a bit further?
Well, I think it's not bad, and of course we rolled over all the virtually all the existing trade agreements that we had through the EU, and we have got an FTA with the EU itself, which often doesn't get mentioned. So I'm basically happy with the pace. Yes. I think obviously the missing element is the US trade deal. I wish we could have made better progress on that. I think there have been moments in the past 5-6 years where we could have made better progress, but the current US administration doesn't seem to want to do bilateral trade deals as a matter of principle at the moment, so it's not surprising we haven't got one.
We are now in a world where trade barriers are multiplying. So the IMF said in a report earlier this year that in about 2016 to 2017 there were about 500 trade restrictions globally a year. We're now at 2,500. So we're shifting, if you like, from a world of free trade to trusted trade in a way. Is it realistic, do you think, that we'll be landing new free trade agreements at a time when everybody is now paying far more attention to strategic autonomy and de-risking supply chains?
These things come and go, and they're not entirely incompatible either. I agree we're in a mode at the moment of focusing on domestic security, reshoring, all that agenda. I think it's at the margin. And I think the mood can change, and it could change under a new US administration. It could change for wider reasons. So I don't give up on these things.
And we've got about 7 free trade agreements that are not done, but which are underway. So India, GCC, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Switzerland, South Korea. Any of those that you would prioritise?
Well, I mean, I think we'd all love to get an India trade deal. When I was doing EU trade back when I was a civil servant, we were trying to get an EU-India deal, and it failed because principally EU member states had too many divergent interests. I think it's easier to have a purely bilateral trade deal, as we're now negotiating. My understanding is we're actually quite close. We're not. Obviously, I'm not sort of directly involved in the negotiations, but I think good progress has been made, and it is within reach, certainly.
And which of these trade deals do you think would become less attractive or less possible if we signed up to a policy of dynamic alignment with the EU on, say, goods trade?
So they all get less possible if you subtract areas from your own negotiating offer, because you've given the right to determine them to some other entity, and that's effectively what would happen in, dynamic alignment in a meaningful form. We would have given up the right to change those rules, and as free trade agreements are precisely about trying to find a balance of those things, we make it more difficult in all of them at the margin. If we do that.
Would Japan, Australia, New Zealand and CPTPP have been impossible if we'd had dynamic alignment on goods with the EU?
Well, I think they would have been much more difficult. I don't know, I hesitate to say they would be impossible. They would definitely have been less good because, to take the Australia case, one of the big advantages of that, and I wish we'd gone further, to be honest, but we are where we are, is agricultural trade. And if we have given up the right to set our own terms of trade, then it's going to be more difficult to reach those agreements. It just stands to reason.
And the original target was that 80% of UK trade would be covered by FTAs. Do you think that goal, as it stands today, is possible or impossible?
Well, it depends on the Americans and an American deal. I don't think anything else can shift the dial hugely. It doesn't look like the current US administration is interested in such deals. That's not true, of course, of the whole American political system, and the administration is not the only player in US trade policy. So, again, the politics in America could change and things could get easier, but I guess not till 2025 at the earliest.
If President Trump is re-elected in the United States, does that change the dynamics and the possibilities?
Well, I think it does. I mean, of course, who knows for sure how these things are going to play out. What I have heard from US Republicans, at least, is that we shouldn't assume a President Trump's general scepticism about free trade would necessarily be an insuperable obstacle to a UK-US deal. But of course, I can't speak for them. I can only speak say what I think our policy should be, and I think we should be keen to do such a deal and ready to talk about it.
You think it becomes more possible if there's a change of administration, or less possible?
Well, it looks... The Biden administration hasn't been particularly interested in bilateral free trade agreements. Again, second terms can be different from first terms. Indeed, they very often are on things like this. So I wouldn't write everything off. I think one of the problems is that in the last couple of years, we have looked a bit reticent from our side about such a deal, and I think we should change that.
Julie.
Thank you very much, Chair. David, you've written that trade agreements are not a good fit for the UK in tackling trade barriers. For the benefit of the committee, could you expand a little on that and perhaps also explain what trade policy tools the government should be prioritising instead?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to appear here. I mean, very much, as Lord Frost has already mentioned, about services. I mean, the UK, 50% of our trade, or perhaps more indeed, is in services. Free trade agreements actually do very little for services. Similarly, most modern trade barriers now are regulatory in nature. They're about companies having to, and companies, after all, are who does all of this trade. I mean, we often talk about government actions are all that matters. It's actually companies that do most of the trade. They face regulatory barriers from different regulations. Those are very difficult to bind in free trade agreements, and in fact, we haven't really done so in free trade agreements we've signed to date because countries are very reluctant to sign away their rights to set future regulations. In that sense, free trade agreements, which are more about tariff reduction, where you're a major commodity producer, well, we're not in most areas a major commodity producer. So we might get a tariff reduction in India, say, on Scotch whisky. Well, that would be worth something. But in general, for most of the things that we would be looking to export more of, for example, various services, you could also look at, say, defence manufacturing. These aren't areas where tariffs are the main, or indeed at all the issue. Unfortunately, where that leaves you is that there's no one single tool that can do this for you. And I know we look for the magic bullet post-Brexit. You know, what's the single thing we can do that will change everything? I'm afraid there isn't. I'm afraid that what you have to do is do an awful lot of things right. You have to be talking to a lot of countries about all of these barriers. You have to be doing, for example, what was, I think, a successful agreement with Switzerland on mutual recognition of financial services. We also need, and I think Lord Frost was absolutely right here, to look at the domestic agenda. Now, we may have different suggestions of what we think would make a difference on the domestic agenda, but ensuring that we're set up to support exporters in our domestic policy choices, I think is hugely important as well, and an often overlooked part of the trade policy agenda.
Thank you. You've also written, it's hard to imagine a UK presence making a meaningful difference to a struggling WTO. What should the UK be looking to do at a more multi or plurilateral level?
Frankly, for a country like the UK, I think it's fair to say that in the UK we have a view that we're generally supportive of trade. I'm afraid to say that, for example, for the US, that's not necessarily the case. Even with the EU, there's a certain amount of withdrawal from that position at the moment. The UK and many other mid-sized powers, as we call them, Japan, for example, we want there to be trade. We want there to be trade rules. I'm pretty worried that at the moment other countries are moving away from that. We need to do as much as we can to protect the trade rules. I don't think we're going to get any new agreements, but we should be foremost among the countries saying trade rules are important, and whoever puts them under pressure, whether that's the US, the EU, our view is that we need a single set of trade rules. Even if we can't expand them, maybe we can't. And we're in the situation where there isn't a formal set of e-commerce rules at the global level, even though eBay has been up and running for, I think it's now coming up to 30 years. And it seems to me that we can't have much faith in new agreements at the WTO when that's the case. There is a negotiation ongoing, which we're part of, to put in place some rules for e-commerce on a plurilateral level. We should do what we can. The UK needs to be, in my opinion, open to talking with other countries. We need to say we believe the rules are important. I think we should join the replacement for the appellate body, which the US has vetoed its actual functioning. This is about dispute settlement. I think the UK should show a signal that we think that is important to us, and we should join it. But generally, again, it's the same thing. It's about trying to do multiple things, talk to a number of countries, try to keep trade flows open, try as much as we can to support our companies in exporting and generally trading.
Thank you very much.
Can I just check? Did you say that you didn't think new deals were going to be possible? So that list of 7, India, GCC, Canada, Mexico, Israel, Switzerland, South Korea.
No, that was about the WTO. I don't think new deals are possible at the WTO level.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, Shanker. I'm quoting everyone here, their own words, but you've written that the UK accession to CPTPP is a seismically important geostrategic, if I could say it properly, event, with CPTPP increasingly seen as the alternative liberalising framework to the WTO. Could you expand on that, what you meant by that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you've got to go back to the genesis of the predecessor to the CPTPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and why that was developed. And it was developed initially as an agreement between New Zealand and Singapore, really because in the early 2000s, the WTO system, we'd had the Seattle Ministerial, we'd had the collapse of the momentum that David Henig just referred to in the WTO. And I think liberalizing countries were looking for an alternative mechanism to continue the process of liberalization, even though it was not really occurring at the WTO level. And that then became the P4, the P4 plus 1 ultimately became the CPTPP, and the US, obviously joined it. Helped craft a lot of the language, and then obviously withdrew when President Trump came into power. The reason I think this is such a powerful tool is that, first of all, it's a dynamic agreement. So the countries are being added. You're looking at countries like Indonesia, you're looking at Thailand. I mean, even China, although I doubt that China will be able to accede to the CPTPP. But there is interest from a lot of the most successful trading countries, and where the growth actually is. The growth is primarily in North America and Asia. And that's what the CPTPP is about. It's also a liberalizing plurilateral agreement based on mutual recognition, as opposed to regulatory harmonization. So it is challenging the WTO. The multilateral world, the WTO world, is obviously the most important and the optimal way of securing liberalization and deepening trade openness around the world, and therefore increasing our global GDP per capita. But you have to work on multiple levels, and if the WTO system is stalled, I think the CPTPP becomes much more important. Rahm Emanuel, who is the US ambassador to Japan, noted that when the UK joined the CPTPP, that he sent a tweet out saying that now the Atlantic and the Pacific are singular. So I think he recognised, a former Obama chief of staff, recognised the importance and the significance of that, because I suspect that with the UK acceding to the CPTPP, that will not be the last country that is not a Pacific country that accedes to this agreement, and it makes the agreement not just a regional agreement. And it's where you see most of the innovations in trade. So David Henig referred to trade agreements not really covering services, not really covering domestic regulation. And services has lagged goods. Obviously, we've had decades of goods tariff liberalization. Services is relatively new to the international trading system in terms of disciplines on it. Really came out of the General Agreement on Trade and Services in 1994. But you've seen successive agreements like NAFTA and other agreements that have progressively started to try to develop disciplines in services, and CPTPP is one of the most advanced of those. First, to have a good regulatory practice chapter, first to look at things like cost-benefit analysis, first to look at things like how state-owned enterprises affect global trade, the difficulties in the WTO that were referred to with the appellate body are primarily because of the US being concerned about the definition of public body and how that is interpreted in international trade. So we need to push the boundaries of those things, and those things are particularly important to the UK because, as he rightly says, we are primarily a services economy, and therefore domestic regulation, these sorts of things are extremely important to us. So for all of these reasons, I think CPTPP is very important.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Shanker, if in the theoretical scenario where China did meet the rules, should the UK support China's accession to CPTPP?
So I think China is such a major topic and major issue that I think, again, you have to have a multi-tiered approach to it. And I think one of the tiers is to say, and this is something where the UK, I think, can play a role, because I think, frankly, the US has tended to oscillate between doing nothing about China distortions and state-owned enterprises and so forth, to the pendulum swings completely in the other direction, and the US tends to national security, tariffs, all these other things, and talk about decoupling, which is neither possible nor desirable. And that could have a significant impact on the global economy. So I think what you've got to do with China is recognize that it is the distortions caused by their not just state-owned companies, but by private companies that benefit from government privileges and so forth, that actually affect global trade and actually affect our own producers. So if you look at steel producers in the UK or steel producers in the US, certainly adversely affected by China state-owned steel industry, same with textiles and so forth, and you can go through the list. So you need to develop a mechanism to deal with China distortions, which is a robust tool, and I've proposed a tariffication of distortions tool to deal with those distortions. But where the Chinese economy is not distorted, if it can be proven that there is an import that's coming into the global system that isn't distorted, we should welcome that import.
So
you've got to be able.
It's a kind of yes if, as it were.
Yeah, you've got to be able to send both signals at the same time. And the difficulty in our policy to China has been we've been unable to send any signal really to China.
Okay.
So in the context,
I'm going to just move us on, just because we've got a long list of questions to get through. So, Lord Frost, can I just check on China and CPTPP? Did you have a view on that? If they met the market entry conditions, should we welcome them or block them?
I think I'd have the same view as Shanker, actually, that it's too complicated to simplify, but with a yes or no, and the policy has to be multi-layered and must take into account security as well as trade issues.
Okay, David Henig? On China and CPTPP?
I mean, broadly the same. I think if China, I think the UK policy, and I was working on China issues in government about 15 years ago, and it was always the view then that you've got to hope, the UK is a country that supports trade, we've got to hope that other countries will support trade, and if they do, we want to welcome them in. If they don't, then the answer is no. So can CPTPP be the process that helps to do that? I suspect in the current context, no, and therefore I suspect it's not going to happen, but I think we should at least hold out the possibility that it could.
Thanks
very much, Chair. Lord Frost, you were the chief negotiator for the UK on the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. How satisfied are you with the effect on UK trade that agreement has actually had?
Well, as I said, I'm very happy with the way things have developed. I think there are massive measurement difficulties here, whether you're looking at value or volume, very sensitive to base year, all this kind of thing. But I think a fair picture of where we are is that goods exports have fallen off maybe 2-3% in volume. Overall goods trade is flat in volume terms, and we've seen a big services boom. So actually overall trade is up. There are many other things going on though. So sort of attributing causality, positive or negative, to the TCA is really difficult. But when you consider that many people said trade would fall by 15% and growth would fall, this is a very different picture so far.
So you don't accept the OBR's figures in terms of the drop in trade and their more pessimistic view of the impact of Brexit on trade more generally?
Well,
have we got our cake and can we eat it? That's the question.
I don't, and I think the OBR's figures, they're not the OBR's own figures. They are the OBR's kind of mashup of a bunch of studies that actually date principally from 2018, 2019, mostly before we even knew what the TCA was going to be. That 4% figure that is so often quoted, actually most of it rests on the belief that trade openness is linked to productivity, is linked to growth, which I think is disputed in the economics profession. I would certainly dispute it. I think a fairer assessment of the impact is probably a bit under 1% of GDP one-off, as Rob Jenrick and I said in our article the other day.
Okay. In terms of, for example, SMEs, especially in high-growth sectors, I think they're in a position, many of them have decided to withdraw from export markets almost entirely. And, there are going to be more challenges facing them towards the end of the month as other border checks kick in. So is that good for UK trade, that, we're taking perhaps quite a significant sector out of our export potential into other countries? And what would you do to encourage that SME sector to re-engage with their past export markets? What would help?
So a lot of the evidence is anecdotal, of course, rather than reliable in this area. I was reading with interest the evidence from one of your previous witnesses. I think it was the witness from the Brussels Chamber of Commerce, saying that where pre-existing trading relationships existed or where SMEs traded outside the EU as well as with it, it had held up pretty well. The task was encouraging SMEs to believe they could still trade within this new environment. And I certainly think the government has a role in doing this, and it has done a fair bit, I think, in the last few years. I think there is more it could do, particularly in making information available in a useful way. But I think by and large the government has responded to the needs.
David, I've read that you've suggested that the next government, of whatever political shade that may be, really should introduce a nationwide trade strategy consultation, which would look at tying together things like industrial policy, net zero, and a much more shared benefit for a majority of workers and people involved in industry and commerce. So, how is that going to operate, and is that going to reverse? I mean, I don't accept Lord Frost's view on the figures, but is that going to reverse some of the worst impacts of what we've experienced with Brexit?
Well, starting with SMEs, because that was being discussed, there's no doubt that the current global trade system is pretty biased against small and medium enterprises from exporting. There is a marked difference between the share of SME trade within the single market as against anybody's record outside of it. So SMEs are the companies that get most hit, but it's not just the decision that the UK made around the form of trade relationship we want with the EU that causes that. It's also there are a number of regulatory issues. I mean, every year the EU, the UK, many other countries introduce more and more regulation. Now we can argue whether that's for good and not so good reasons. The cumulative effect, though, is to make it harder and harder for SMEs to trade. Now, put that into a trade strategy. What are we trying to do here? What do we actually want our economy to look like? How much do we want it to link to the industrial strategy? For example, one of the things that we could sign up to in the European region as a whole, not with the EU specifically, is something called the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention on Rules of Origin, which sounds terribly dull, and it is. But what it allows to do is it supports the participation of UK component manufacturers in cross-European supply chains. That's something which we've struggled to do since we completed the TCA. I think broadly that's probably positive, but then you have to judge that against, well, would that stop us from doing any other trade agreements? I think in this case it wouldn't, and therefore it's something that you should do. It's a step forward. But then there's some other choices. Lord Frost has alluded to immigration. It's a huge choice on the way that we think about immigration in terms of trade. We talk about services having gone up. One of the big success stories of UK sectors is higher education. But higher education gets caught in the immigration numbers into the UK. So what are we going to choose to do there? And this is where the trade strategy comes in. What are we actually trying to achieve? It's very easy to say, let's sign some free trade agreements. As I've alluded to, it doesn't really, that doesn't tell us whether that's going to support UK companies from exporting. What are we trying to do? We want to get into, for example, if we think that green goods is a growth area, we want to support our companies. How are we going to do that? Mutual recognition perhaps with our largest markets. I hope we've gone past the point where we're saying we need to dynamically align with the entirety of EU law or not. That's the choice. It's not that choice. The choice is which sectors, what are our benefits in certain sectors? If we align in this sector, does that provide a benefit? Can we stabilise our regulation to provide companies with a boost? How do we get people to invest? Those are the kind of questions I think you need to look at in a trade strategy. And that then supports the kind of cross-government working and the trade-offs you need to make to have successful trade policy. I just don't think we've really done most of this. I think that we needed to replicate all the agreements we already had. We had to get an agreement with the EU. I am aware the government had to get new agreements to show that it was succeeding in trade policy. I think we now need to take a slight pause, need to say, look, this is where we've got to so far. There are certain things that we don't, that just don't seem to be working. This is, how we can make them better. And perhaps, my sense is that I think that there's been a little bit more of an impact than Lord Frost suggests on EU trade. But in a way, he's right that it hasn't. I never thought UK EU trade would completely kind of fall off a cliff like some people. I thought there would be some impact, and there has been some impact. But now we need to look at that and say some of that, particularly in SMEs, particularly in goods, could we do something to reverse that? Those are the sort of things I would like to see in a trade strategy, and then to pursue that not just with the EU, but with countries in the region and, frankly, more widely.
Thank you very much. David, so following on from that, what can we do to help SMEs to trade more widely? And Lord Frost, what are we not doing with what we've already got? Are we being stick in the mud old-fashioned and just sticking to what we knew before rather than getting on with the trade deals that we've actually got in place?
I almost feel I want to answer Lord Frost's questions. I go on about implementation so much; it's so important that we do that. But never mind, you give me the harder part.
Oh, sorry.
Which is SMEs. I think we have to recognise the influence that you have on that these regulations are having. I think you have to prioritise. If you think it's important to prioritise SMEs, then I think that government needs to do more to frankly provide them the kind of service that often does for larger companies of saying, right, here are the barriers you're facing, we're going to actually try and tackle them in negotiations with other countries.
What is the more specifically?
Well, specifically, SMEs will be facing certain barriers in other markets. What are some of them you can't get around? But if there's a regulation that there is too costly for them, there's some customs checks it's taking too long, or it's too expensive to do the forms. What can are there ways in which government can basically reduce the costs of SMEs to make their exports competitive? It's not just about information. I think it's actually about the kind of actions. Now,
Yes.
The government actually does that with larger companies often. We actually, I dare to mention this, but the organisation Lord Frost used to run, the Scotch Whisky Association, is remarkably good for all its members, whether small or large, at picking the barriers, talking to government about them, and then government, our embassies around the world, actually take those cases up with governments. They may be tax issues that they need to resolve. It may be about particular regulations, things on the bottle, anything that can be done to basically facilitate those exports. I'm afraid there's no magic bullet to this. It's just about, what are your problems? Can we do something more to fix them? And I think governments don't generally prioritise SMEs. They generally prioritise larger companies because obviously that's greater exports, but that has an impact. So these are the decisions that have to be made. Are we actually going to be serious about prioritising SMEs? Or in fact, actually, the way of the world is it's large companies, and so maybe another way is you say, okay, SMEs, we regard smaller companies, mainly you're going to be feeders to large companies, and we're going to encourage large companies to source from smaller companies in the UK. There's a number of things to discuss, and I'm afraid I fear I'm already going on too long, but it's that sort of thing.
Thank you, David. Sorry I gave you the tough question. Lord Frost.
Well, it's sort of the same answer, I think, in some ways, that I think it's important not to get too focused on kind of one category of problem. And of course we should be doing more trade agreements if we can. But it is only one part of the problem. I agree with David actually on a trade strategy. I think actually, what you were coming close to saying was, governments need a clear economic policy and philosophy of which trade is a part. And that has perhaps been one of the issues in the last few years. But so you've got that at the top, you've got trade agreements, you've got the need to implement trade agreements and manage the disputes within them if there are any. You've got ideally regulatory dialogue within and outside those agreements. You've got then government support, and I think the Scotch Whisky Association model is a good one where industry needs are taken up by embassies and by governments, and you've got to be able to do all those things. And if you focus on just one of them, then it isn't going to work very well.
Thank you.
Ian Lavery.
Thanks, Chair. Lord Frost, you're obviously vehemently opposed to any form of dynamic alignment, and that's been the position throughout the negotiations, etc. Basically on the grounds that you want to maintain UK sovereignty in terms of UK regulations. How do you think the general export community view the idea of any form of dynamic alignment with the EU rules as a way of possibly overcoming post-Brexit trade friction?
So I think there's some lack of clarity about what's meant by dynamic alignment sometimes. And of course, it's simply a commitment from us to mimic EU rules in a particular sector doesn't in itself deal with the problem, because you're still dealing with two separate legal entities. There still is friction between those two things. There still is a degree of paperwork. Now, maybe if you can get mutual recognition between the two, that would help a lot. Perhaps you can reduce the levels of paperwork, but it doesn't solve the problem. It's not single market-like. The only way you can do that is if we accept EU legal supervision that their laws are enforced in our country in particular areas, and then they know we're operating the same things. But that is a line that we have always been unwilling to cross for wider reasons. You're outsourcing your law-making ability to another entity, and I don't think that's what Brexit was about.
But how do you actually think? What's your view on what the export community actually see it? Not just the position you see, the position they feel at this moment in time? Because reading through the briefs, etc., it looked as if there's a lot of differences of opinions in this.
So I think there are differences of opinions, and it hugely depends on sector, size of company, what your trading patterns are globally or at the European level, and so on. I think it's a truism that to say that companies will always want fewer barriers to trade. That's obvious and right and correct. But what it's realistic to get by way of reduced barriers depends on the political environment you're working in. And when you're working between two sovereign entities, then you'll always be able to reduce the barriers less than you would be where there's one single lawmaking body. And we're not in that environment. So companies' views will be reflected by the reality of the environment that we're in.
Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. In any agreement or relationship, aren't we giving up some degree of sovereignty? Aren't we swapping some surrender to the EU, which you're not very happy with, to giving that up elsewhere in terms of dispute resolution and the rest of it?
Well, not really, I think, or only to different extents. Of course, any trade agreement, any agreement of any kind, involves making commitments to behave under a certain way, obviously. And no agreement will work if that were not the case. But in an FTA-type relationship, the final decision-taking authority remains within the two parties, the nation-state or the EU. In a more integrated relationship, it doesn't. And that is a fundamental difference between the two.
Well, thank you for that. Just on this dispute with the OBR about the trade growth, and thanks for the comments earlier on the 4%. Does the OBR say that they're basing their calculations on our trade openness? Is that their position? Because you said that earlier, that you think their interpretation of the world was based upon that prism. Did they say that?
So all the OBR has done is look at other people's studies, and they're quite open about this. They're not doing their own calculations. They're deriving it from previous studies that have been done.
Well, thanks for that. I want to just focus on a discrete area, and it's CBAM, and I wonder if Shanker, Singham and yourself might be able to help me with this, because the Centre for Climate Change and Economics and Policy in the Grantham Institute said a robust carbon pricing framework with anti-carbon leaking measures is needed to support deep decarbonisation of industry on the pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. You've both expressed strong opposition to the government's plan to follow the EU in introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So firstly, how would you address, perhaps Shanker can come to this first, UK exports facing an EU CBAM tariff wall? Shanker, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. And let me just say one quick thing on SMEs and one suggestion, which is just to let the committee know that under the chairmanship of Lord Frost's colleague, Lord Agnew, we've established a Trade Facilitation Commission that's specifically designed to help SMEs and use things like digital trade corridors and custom simplifications and so forth, and trusted trader schemes to improve their lot. So I'd encourage the committee to look into that. On CBAM, I think the first question is, do we need to do something about carbon leakage, and what is the carbon leakage problem? The carbon leakage problem is primarily being brought about by a series of market distortions in some of the larger carbon emitters in the world, particularly obviously China, but to some extent India and other places as well. And so if the question is, should we do something about the distortions in those markets that lead to carbon leakage, then absolutely the answer is yes. However, what I would submit is that we need to do something that is more forensic and deals with the actual issue of distortion and deals with the internalizing that particular externality. And there are many proposals. The EU CBAM is only one. in our modelling of the effect of the EU CBAM in terms of its impact on GDP per capita for UK households, it has a pretty significant effect because it will increase the cost of very basic items, things like steel, etc., but also things like fertilizers, which will increase the cost for farmers in the UK considerably. So, and fertilizer costs are already high, so for them it'll increase energy costs substantially. So there's a real cost to this. And what I would advocate is that we look at different mechanisms, different tools to deal with carbon leakage, make the decision based on what achieves your goal of dealing with carbon leakage, while not imposing such severe constraints on the rest of your economy and on your households in terms of energy prices. I think there's been a sort of rush to just copy the EU CBAM because that's the carbon leakage mechanism that we know about. But if I go back to 2021, the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which was included the NFU, included many environmental groups, agreed a mechanism for dealing with carbon emissions and climate change that was more like a tariffication of the distortion mechanism that I'd sort of raised earlier.
Shanker,
I think that kind of
okay, is that alternative?
Effective.
How close are we to even knowing what that alternative mechanism is? You say that an alternative is desirable, but the EU CBAM is with us, and if we don't follow suit, are we not running the risk of other cheaper carbon-intensive products landing here on these shores if we don't do that?
Well, EU CBAM is with the EU and is scheduled for phasing in terms of tariffs and sectors. But we have to remember that there are currently six sectors that the CBAM applies to. EU CBAM applies to, but there are 42 products in the pipeline. So the danger here is that every industry that wants, to be protected will use this as the reason, and fairly soon we'll have a substantial increase in our tariffs across the piece, which will have a significant negative effect on the economy of the country. I think, in terms of the alternatives that need to be investigated, that Trade and Agriculture Commission report, and it's a gov.uk, it's on gov.uk. From 2021 has been sitting there, and it has the support of lots of different groups, NFU, environmental groups, consumer groups, etc. It was a hard-won consensus in the Trade and Agriculture Commission, and yet we haven't really done anything with it in the intervening 3 years. And I think that's disappointing to say the least. But there are other mechanisms as well around the world that look at pricing of carbon in other ways. And I think a decision of this magnitude needs not to be taken at the speed at which it is being taken, and there is an opportunity to go back to develop better tools, more forensic tools that deal with distortion, and I think the distortion mechanism that's proposed in the TAC report is the right way to go, and I absolutely commend that to this group.
Thank you. Lord Frost, I don't want to kind of bring you in
yes,
here.
Sure.
And just basically, is there time to do this?
Well, I guess I would agree with Shanker that if you must do this thing, then there are better ways of doing it. But I guess my reservations would be deeper. I think we've got CBAMs at all in Europe because collectively we've got a misguided energy and climate policy that pushes up energy prices. It's driving high energy production out of the country. It produces an entirely notional reduction in carbon emissions. And then with CBAMs we compound that error by pushing up the cost of the necessary imports of the goods that we used to make in the UK. And this just seems like...
Are you questioning the desirability of the reduction in carbon emissions? Is that your fundamental...
I'm questioning the desirability of the way we are going about it, right, which is a high cost, sort of high fundamental cost, high energy price cost, inefficient way of going about it. It's a bad policy, so it's going to drive bad policy in other areas. If I could just add one point on this, is that the Windsor framework, of course, has a number of unfortunate effects in this whole area, but one is that it makes the pressure on the British government to adopt the same system as the EU to avoid creating further barriers between GB and Northern Ireland, and that is also unfortunate, I think, in this context.
While we're on border mechanisms, so the new operating model at the border, I think the Cabinet Office says that's going to be about £330 million of extra costs, which are going to come onto the prices that consumers pay. The true cost may be much higher than that. Do you think the cost estimates are accurate? Could they be higher? And should we actually be trying to reduce these costs, not raise them?
Well, the cost estimates themselves, who knows? I mean, these things have always turned out to be wrong in the past. So I would hesitate to know.
I think the Cabinet Office may have got that wrong.
It's entirely possible if one looks at all the estimates that were made about the costs of bringing in customs controls before Brexit. A lot of them turned out to be exaggerated. They could be higher, they could be lower. I myself opposed bringing in these measures within government. I think I've said that, and I think it's a pity that we have brought in these internal control measures in quite this way. I don't think it's necessary. I think we should be focusing on having one single set of controls for all countries and as light touch as we could possibly make them. Yeah. So I think it's a bit unfortunate, personally.
Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. Lord Frost, is the management of UK-EU trade well undertaken by the FCDO?
I think it is shifting from a purely political relation, or one where the kind of high politics is the most important element of it, to one which is more technical, more like other big trade relationships around the world. You need a lot of expert input to do that. So it's less which department, as you know, how do you get the right experts in and focused on the right things.
I guess my follow-up question to that is, you've written an article about saying whether or not we're recognising the opportunities. I think it's quite fair to argue that ministers are perhaps the most powerful ministers in terms of their roles and their departments outside of the European Union for about 40 years. Are we taking advantage of that? And so is there not an argument to be made that actually DBT should either be merged into the Foreign Office, or the Foreign Office should be relinquishing its control over UK-EU trade to DBT?
I think the most important thing in all of this is, I mean, different countries do their trade operations in different ways. So I don't think there's one perfect structure. I think what you've got to ensure is that whether it's in one department or with a mechanism of some kind, you can look at all aspects of the relationships with a country, and that is one of the big gains in this era of Brexit. We can look at the security, we can look at the trade relationship, the development relationship, the foreign policy relationship, all together. And you need a mechanism that is capable of doing that. And the important thing is to have it, and then everyone knows what it is. And I think it's a bit like David's point on a trade strategy. You've got to be explicit about it. Everyone's got to know what they're trying to achieve and working to the common goal.
One of the key aspects of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was the creation of, I'm sorry, I don't want to make this predominantly just about the EU, but let's use it as the example, was the creation of specialised trade committees in which we would be able to help set the agenda and discuss issues that might be controversial, difficult, where trade flows were not really operating in the way they should. As you well know, I represent one of the largest fishing communities in this country. They feel particularly aggrieved about things. So who should rightly be actually responsible for the agendas of the specialised trade committees, and who should actually be going in to try and ask for negotiations or renegotiations in these areas that are highly technical, highly linked to imports and exports and tariffs perhaps related to them? Who bears the responsibility for that?
So ultimately, these committees should primarily be staffed by the experts in the area of that committee, but they all have a political character. So I'm not saying you should only have DEFRA fisheries officials at this committee, because in the end, if problems are to be resolved, they're often resolved through trade-offs that go beyond one committee. So you need some awareness of that somewhere in the system.
Again, and the lack of engagement, though, with those specialised trade committees since we've left the European Union and the transition period had ended is pretty woeful, I would argue. And in fact, you haven't really seen much resolution to some of the issues, not just in fishing, but in other areas. Is there not a problem here that actually the diplomatic arm of the Foreign Office is getting in the way of the economic and trade perspective of DBT and other parts of government?
I mean, the honest answer is I don't know, because obviously I've not been in government for the last 2.5 years. It wouldn't at all surprise me if, the kind of politics and the official trade expert bits and machinery were not working entirely smoothly together. But I can't say that is the reason, because I've not been.
Would a merger with DBT into the Foreign Office work?
So I think the problem with that is you create a super ministry then, which is really, really big and has a lot of money, and has somebody bestriding it like a colossus at the top. And because the job is unmanageable, then you essentially have a series of very powerful deputies, and therefore, if you're not careful, you recreate the same problem in a different way. You can't get round the need for a single strategy and total clarity by everybody in managing the relationship.
Well, given our precedent of putting members of the House of Lords in as Foreign Secretary, you may have done yourself out of being the colossus that bestrides that merger. But could I go to David very quickly on the questions I've just asked, and then Shanker, I saw had his hand up, and then I'll pass back to you, Chair.
Yes, well, I agree with some of that. I wouldn't be merging the Foreign Office and DBT. I wouldn't want to do this committee out of a job either.
Don't worry. We've got other things to do. More power.
But no, more significantly, look, we were talking earlier about. Lord Frost talked a lot about sovereignty. I actually think it's a little bit more blurred than that. We have to make decisions on things like carbon pricing. There are different reasons why we may or may not give away some of our sovereignty. The same applies to a US trade deal. We know the reason we're not doing a US trade deal is because we would have to change our agricultural standards. We have to make those choices. How do we make those choices as a government? Government makes them, traditionally, in the way I think government works best, is when the Cabinet Office is in charge of if you like, working with all the departments to facilitate agreement between them, where the experts in each department are engaging with their fellow experts in other countries, and therefore I think that DBT should have responsibility for EU trade, just as DEFRA would have responsibility for talking with the EU about technical matters around food. I think you're being a bit harsh on the specialised committees, if only because they need somewhere to go politically. So I think we need a thicker level of political contact with the EU. I think we've had a problem in the past where the EU has been seen as been seen as all or nothing. So I mean, this came out last week in the whole question of youth mobility, and the EU said we would like to do this, and the UK Conservative Party, Labour Party, everyone said no. Well, no is not a very good answer here. The answer is, well, that's very interesting, what you want to do. Here's what we want to do, and let's talk about it. I just don't think we've got the right relationship up and running, and I think that's the opportunities we need to thicken the ties. This is not about remain or leave or anything like that. This is about moving to the right structure that works for the UK, and the right structure is that our specialists should be talking to the specialists in the EU. The Cabinet Office operates as the kind of the place in which the trade office and the political level decisions are made. And we have a much thicker contact, and we have to make those choices. I'm afraid trade policy at the end of the day is about making those trade-offs, and I fear that we've been ducking too many of them.
Thank you. Shanker, and then back to you, Chair.
Thank you.
Yes, so I mean, just very briefly on this, I would say that you need to have a single trade negotiator. David is right that trade policy consists of trade-offs, and the person at the sharp end of the negotiations needs to know that they have the ability to make the trade-offs necessary, albeit with consultation across Whitehall, consultation across government and so forth. But they need to know that they make that offer, and the other party, the person they're negotiating with, needs to know that they're capable of making that kind of trade-off. And deals that get done are done. The white heat of deal making is when you make those trade-offs in the room with the two trade negotiators together. And I think there are good reasons why we have the machinery, the negotiating machinery we currently have up to this point. But I think from this point on, we need to be clear that there is a single trade negotiator, and I would bring all of the trade negotiations, including the EU, negotiations and further EU discussions and improvements that can be made to the EU-UK TCA under one roof, so that those proper trade-offs can be made. Because I think we have been struggling with some of our trade negotiations because we haven't had that kind of structure. And our trade partners have been able to say, well, you can't really deliver because you're not in charge of a particular aspect, whether it's agriculture or SBS or whatever.
Thank you very much. Andy MacDonald.
Thanks, Chair. David, you wrote that the relationship between the Department for International Trade and stakeholders is on the surface relatively constructive, but private conversations reveal a different picture, sometimes verging on the dysfunctional. And announcements are accompanied by supportive quotes from businesses, but rarely reflect often scathing private opinions. It all seems a bit difficult. And I know you're a recovering official, is that right? You were formerly
a long time ago
an official. But you said that stakeholders see trade officials as arrogant, naive, obsessively secretive, and uninterested in a partnership approach. And on the other side, officials see stakeholders as liable to leak sensitive information and preferring to whinge rather than engage. It's all a bit dysfunctional, isn't it? How can that be fixed? You've got the experience. You can tell us the answer.
There's just been too much. The straightforward answer on that is there's just been too much secrecy. That you can't be in a situation where government basically hardly wants to talk to stakeholders because it thinks they're going to leak everything, and stakeholders are afraid of talking to government or saying what they really think in case their access gets removed. That's just not the way. When I was working in government, that wasn't the way in which good government was being done. That was under both Labour and Conservative prime ministers. You've got to share things with stakeholders. Most of what happens in the room in trade negotiations is not actually that secret. It's a terrible thing to reveal, but actually most of the time people can work out what's going on from outside if they have a pretty good idea what both sides want. There's a little bit that's secret, which is that nobody knows what, at the end of the day, each side will actually compromise on. But everything else, most things, what the text is going to be, not terribly secret. Open up more, share more, including, by the way, with Parliament as well. It needs to be a lot more collaborative approach. This is about Team UK getting the best for the whole of the UK. Get rid of all the non-disclosure agreements and the non-reports on kind of negotiating rounds. Just open up. And the best example here, and I'm suggesting that you might like a trip there, New Zealand do this really well. They had something called Trade for All. They got together all their stakeholders.
It's called
Trade for All.
Trade for All.
They got together a lot of their stakeholders. They put together a really good report, and they work really collaboratively. Everybody supports their objectives. Net result: New Zealand probably, I think, is seen as the leading exemplar of trade policy, and I think that's where we need to learn.
That's great.
Just to add, I agree with that. I think we should be less defensive and much more open. I just two comments there. One, I think it's important to take account of not just stakeholders who currently exist and benefit from the way things are, but try to make some assessment of how you could change things and who, by way of firms that don't yet exist but could benefit from doing things differently. So it isn't you've got to avoid regulatory capture by incumbents, is the short version. Second point is just to say, as I always do on these trade occasions, I think it is really important that Parliament gets proper say. And I really believe that the arrangements we've inherited for parliamentary scrutiny of trade agreements are not right. It seems to me, there was a European parliamentary vote on every trade agreement conducted by the EU, and it doesn't seem satisfactory to me that this Parliament doesn't get such a vote, and I think it should.
Yeah. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And just to sort of sum up, we've had some really useful evidence from each of our witnesses in helping us understand how we might grow our economy by exporting more. And I just want to bring things together by lobbing the word in strategy, because we've had, each of our witnesses, I think, has made reference to strategy, but we don't have an explicit strategy for exports. We know that there's an objective to get to $1 trillion by 2030. How do we inform that strategy. And I'm reminded that 20 years ago I used to train salespeople, and I used to say to them that to fail to plan is to plan to fail. So, have we got a plan? Have we got a strategy? Is the trillion figure? Is that something? Does that drive it? What do we need, David? You raised the trade strategy first. Should it be explicit? Should we have a roadmap? Should we have some way of knowing what we're all aiming for and how we're going to get there?
Yes, we should, but it needs to be realistic. I think we've had lots of export strategies and export plans and various things. I don't think that they've really addressed some of the issues. And I think the number one, and you would recognise that, having said that you were involved in sales, I was involved in a previous life in business development as well. We need to get the companies, they're the ones who need to be trading. We need to attract investment here in productive capacity. We need to play to our strengths, if you like, of which we have many, by the way. It's just that they're sort of so variable. Sometimes I think that there's nobody who likes all the UK's strengths, whether it's financial services or culture, defence or universities. We need to try to be, frankly, expanding all of them, and that's the way in which I think that we start to hit our targets. I think my final point, I think we need to decide if exports is actually what we're prioritising here, because I think that what's actually happened in many ways is that we say we're prioritising exports, but actually we're not. There are other policy goals. Now, there'll always be other policy goals, but actually we don't think very much about exports when we're putting in place a lot of our other policies. And you can, whichever side, place you are on the political spectrum, whether that's immigration policy or regulatory policy or whatever, we don't think enough, I don't think, about exports when we're putting in place a lot of domestic policy, and I think we need to change that.
Yeah, and David Frost, whether we thought Brexit was a good idea or not, the one big win is the opportunity to drive exports in parts of the world where we didn't do so before. Where we were lazy and hid behind the EU strategy, and we've now got to develop our own. Do we need something more explicit to provide the focus that David Henig says we need?
So, I'm not myself totally convinced that a simple number plucked out the air for exports is the best way of kind of doing this. I think
that's the best we've got right now,
in some ways. Yeah, it's what there is. I think more important than that is getting the mechanisms and the machinery and the collective direction of travel right. I also think, let's not forget trade is also about imports, and it's about opening your own market, and it's about making your own market as competitive as we can as well. So for both intellectual and practical reasons, I'm slightly sceptical about the target, but I think the target is trying to get us to do the right things, and it's doing the right things that's important.
Okay, and Shanker, where are you on strategy?
Yeah, so I think as Lord Frost just said, you can't just focus on exports, because if you're a manufacturer and you're exporting around the world, you're importing a lot of your raw materials, you're importing a lot of your key inputs. So you need to have a smart global strategy. But I would caveat one thing in terms of a trade strategy, which is you have to be flexible and you have to be able to be reactive to a very dynamic environment. I'll give you two examples of big trade initiatives that did not arise as a result of somebody having a grand, strategy. NAFTA, for example, happened because President Carlos Salinas of Mexico went to the US, went to George Bush Sr. and said, I want to be part of the Canada-US bilateral. Why? Because he wanted to lock in the reforms he was doing in Mexico. And so that's how NAFTA occurred. It was the US reacting to an opportunity that arose. And a lot of trade strategy is putting yourself in a position where you can react to that changing environment. CPTPP is also an example of that. And so I think what you need to do is you need to have the broad contours of a global strategy, which includes both your trade openness, your import approaches, your domestic regulatory environment, because that is very important to your global competitiveness. And that global competitiveness strategy is basically built for all countries along the same lines, which is what can I do to improve my own domestic environment? What can I do unilaterally? What can I do in terms of these FTAs and trade deals? What can I do with things like CPTPP, plurilateral actions? And what can we do to move the multilateral agenda forward? And you need to work on all of those things at the same time.
And is the race to a trillion, is that just a meaningless slogan then, in your view?
Well, I think it's a useful target. It's always useful to have targets. It's a useful target if what you're trying to do is to encourage UK businesses to export more. That's a separate, very small element of your overall strategy. And what I would do with that is I would say, well, how are we going to get to that target? You know, we need to increase the number of trusted traders that exist in the UK. We have a very low number of trusted traders. Perhaps we need to improve our trusted trader schemes so that they're more conducive to small businesses. And you can use targets in that way, but that's not a grand, competitiveness strategy for the country. And I do think you need to have some sense of where you're going with your overall competitiveness, and export sort of feeds into that.
Okay, so all of the measures that we're undertaking are a bit hit and miss, and they're just happening to come together without any real focus on where we need to be and how we need to get there.
Well, I think there's a revealed preference in what the UK is doing. I mean, the only element of the revealed preference that hasn't happened on the bilateral side is the US deal, and that has not happened, not because of us, but because, as was said earlier, the Biden administration is not interested in trade deals with anyone. That may change in the future, but I think we've had a broad approach across those four different dimensions. What we perhaps have not had is a connection between all of them, and a sense that what you need to do if you're for example, the Secretary of State of the Department for Business and Trade, which is looking at both trade and business regulation and domestic regulatory reform, is what can I do to maximize the overall competitiveness of the country? And there is a regulatory dimension, there is a trade dimension, there is a import and export dimension, there's a trade facilitation dimension as well. Let's not forget that it's not just about doing the deals, as David Henig said, it's about making sure that people take advantage of them and traders actually benefit from them. You have to have all of that going forward.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Chair.
Lord Foster, I want to check this. So is having a trade strategy a good thing, in your opinion?
Yes, I think it is, as long as you're realistic about what it can do. As David was saying, some of the core trade-offs, last-minute kind of trade-offs in negotiations are always going to be confidential, but a strategy that sets out what you are trying to do for the country and broadly the mechanisms that will help get you there. I think that is worth being explicit about, yes.
And we should be trying to increase the contribution of trade to our economic rate of growth?
So there is, as I say, the evidence between of the relationship between trade and domestic productivity and growth is, in my view, equivocal. I think you should be trying to improve trade, but you've also got to be trying to improve your own domestic regulatory environment in different ways as well. It goes together.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I'm sorry we overran, but that's been a really interesting session. So thank you very much indeed to all of our witnesses for your evidence today. The committee is hugely grateful to you. That concludes this panel. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently...
Order. Welcome to the second panel for this morning's hearings on export-led growth. I'm delighted that we've got two brilliant witnesses to join us, and Ian Lavery is going to open the bowling.
Thanks very much, Chair. I would like to just start the first question by quoting the current Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Rishi Sunak. In August 22, during the Conservative leadership contest, Mr Sunak said that the trade deals we sign are not and should never be one-sided. And then, during the same contest, Mr Sunak said that the trade agreement with Australia, negotiated by the then Trade Secretary Liz Truss, was one-sided to the detriment of UK farmers. He then, so that's three times I'm quoting Rishi Sunak, he then later said the UK shouldn't sacrifice quality for speed when it comes to trade deals. How right was Mr Sunak? Catherine, do you want to start off?
Unfortunately, one of the problems with letting politicians decide trade deals is they're always going to be playing to their electorate, and I believe Mr Sunak represents an agricultural area of the UK. Agriculture is not what we do. Rarely do I agree with David Henig, but I do agree that if we are ever going to follow an example, we should follow New Zealand. And New Zealand, unlike the EU, worked out after it was dumped by the UK, who used to trade a lot with New Zealand before it joined the EU, it had to work out what it could do effectively and who it could sell to, and it had to invent products that would sell in those markets, including the kiwi fruit, which is actually a version of a Chinese gooseberry, which they developed and marketed internationally. And now people think it's something to do with New Zealand. They could do agriculture very well. They only produce and export, not produce, but export 9 things, agricultural things. They're very, very good at it. The UK has to sit down, if you're looking at your trade thing. I know this is going off your question, but it is actually the most important thing you can do. You've got to look at what you can do well and what you can export effectively. And the UK is brilliant at doing that, and you've been doing it for hundreds of years. And suddenly, this last generation, and unfortunately Sunak is very young, thinks it's all about Europe. It never was. You were importing cocoa and sugar in the 1820s and making chocolate, and Cadbury's became the biggest exporter of food in the world, until it got bought out by Kraft. But, you're very good at this, and what you do is not farming. One of the reasons you don't do farming is because you are about the same size as New Zealand, you have a very similar climate, but you have almost 70 million people, and New Zealand has 5 million people. So it can export excess food. It can make as much food as we make here in the UK and export it to America and China and Japan and all over the world. The UK eats pretty much everything it can make, and it imports a lot more. And the idea that this trade deal was one-sided is the most absurd thing I've ever met. It's so dumb. If Rishi Sunak represented someone in the Midlands, he might know that UK exports of cars have doubled in Australia in 1 year purely because of this trade agreement, and not one car made in Australia has come to the UK. Not one. Because Australia, like New Zealand, had to work out what they were good at making, and they realised it wasn't cars. So they don't make cars anymore. They import them, and they import them now from the UK. And the idea that the UK can somehow compete with Australia in beef is so stupid. The average herd size of a beef herd in the UK is 28 cows. 28 cows can only produce 28 calves. They don't have multiple births, very rarely. Often they don't have a birth at all. That means after 3 years of feeding that herd, you can only make 28 times 300 kilos times the price of a kilo. The average beef herd size in Australia is 800 cows. You cannot compete with Australia on beef. All you're doing is keeping UK people poor. Lamb in the UK now costs £50 a kilo in a supermarket. That's outrageous. That's over like $100 Australian a kilo. You tell someone in Australia that, they laugh at you. They don't believe you. They think you're making it up. You know, I don't understand this country. Accept what you can do it incredibly well. That's plain engines. You sell them all over the world. It's one of our biggest exports in goods. Services.
I'm just going to move us on just because the clock is slightly against us.
Sorry, but I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing a Prime Minister has ever said. He's obviously never looked at what the UK trades. He's never looked at we import 300,000 tonnes of beef every year from Ireland. We can't produce enough food to feed our population, and yet he thinks this is a one-sided trade deal.
I think that was one of the questions, but he did say sacrificing quality for speed when it comes to trade deals. Emily, do you want to?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you guys today. So I think in absolute terms, the size of the Australia trade deal is relatively small economically. I think it is notable that the trade deal did go further in liberalising agricultural tariffs than has been done before in the past. That said, it is a relatively small amount of trade that the UK is opening up to, and there are gains across a number of sectors, including things like machinery and cars, which, as Catherine mentioned, are much more close to our comparative advantages in the UK, so are much more important sectors for us. Overall, however, because Australia is very far away, it isn't necessarily a country that we are trading with a lot relative to a lot of other countries, and it does mean that overall the economic impact is relatively small. I do think there are some other areas of the Australia trade deal that are worth highlighting to this committee, in particular around its services provisions, which were also relatively innovative. So, for example, as part of the trade agreement, there was set up a 2-year regulatory dialogue between the UK and Australia around particular services sectors. So an example of this is in the legal services industries. There has been discussions just last month between the Law Society of the UK and the legal services professions in Australia to really try to overcome some of the specific services barriers that those professions face. So things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications. There's a really good legal training in the UK, and so if we are able to help Australia accept UK lawyers to operate in Australia, I think that's a really important kind of development for the profession, as well as ease of doing business. So kind of fly-in, fly-out type rules within UK and Australia. So that's part of an ongoing regulatory dialogue. We would expect that to take a lot of time, but I think as part of the Australia trade deal, that was a very important new mechanism that was set up.
Thanks. Any McDonald?
Thanks, Chair. Emily, I was going to ask you a little bit about that because I think it was in your report, I think you co-authored it last year. You did say that the UK should play to its strengths by pursuing services trade agreements rather than conventional FTAs. Is that what you're talking about? Is that the sort of precedent that we're referring to in Australia? Is there a service-only agreement with Australia, or are there other models that we think we should be looking at? Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think one of the key things that we have heard already this morning is that the UK's services exports have been bigger than the UK's goods exports for 5 years now. So we are definitely a services superpower. This is something that we should really be focused on. And what we do know is that free trade agreements aren't very good at liberalising services trade. They boost goods trade by 50 to 100%. They boost kind of financial services trade by about 10%. So there is a lot of scope for us to develop specific types of services agreements that could actually help us to overcome the specific barriers that we face in services trade. Now, What is very important as well is that this is really hard. This is not something you can do overnight. It's something that requires a lot of trust in between different regulators. If you are kind of going to another country and saying, we trust your regulatory regime, we're happy for you to regulate your industries as you see fit, and we'll regulate our industries as we see fit, but we're able to make various decisions around things like professional qualifications, things like the ability to do business in different countries, as well as things like financial services specific agreements, then there is a real benefit. And I think there's a really good example of this from Switzerland at the moment. So back in 2016, so a really long time ago now, we set up a council to discuss services trade agreements with a financial dialogue, so a specific financial mutual recognition agreement there. And just last year, it was agreed a Bern financial services agreement, which enables across a number of financial services industries frictionless trade. So, for example, if you are a client advisor in the UK, you are now able to go and advise clients in Switzerland without necessarily registering for businesses there. It also means that even though Switzerland's introducing a requirement for non-Swiss firms to establish a base in their country before you start to make trade there, the UK is the only exception to that rule. So we don't have to establish a base in that country to have particular types of financial services trade. So you can see that this would be incredibly important for our services industries. But I think what we really need to focus on is the idea that this is a strategic importance for the UK. We should accept this as part of our trade strategy. We should focus on services, and we should outline that to make clear to our partners that actually services is where we can liberalise, where we are up for doing these very long dialogues with regulators. We do have the capacity to do that, and there is a lot of opportunity there.
Thank you very much. Where would you target, Emily? Where, if you were drawing up a short list of target countries for those kind of arrangements, what would be on the list?
So I think it's very important to focus on countries that equally have very high regulatory regimes. We have a really good regulatory environment, and we should celebrate that. We also need to focus on countries where perhaps there's lower migration risk, I think, in particular because this is something where often with services trade, you're travelling to another country, perhaps for a short period of time, perhaps for a longer period of time, in order to do business there. So some of the countries that we might want to think about, which are countries which we already have an FTA with, so are countries that you know, are quite familiar to us, include places like Australia, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Singapore. So thinking about those countries where you can actually liberalise and set up those dialogues.
If you look at countries, say for example the US, where we have struggled to get an overarching trade deal done, do you think there is an opportunity to pursue a services-only agreement or not?
I think the US is a very interesting case. If you look at the types of tariffs that they have put in place in the past, they've often been quite goods-focused. If you look at the type of industries that the US is supporting through the ERA, they also are quite goods-focused. So I think that there is an opportunity for us to potentially open up those dialogues with the US, which is, of course, you know, the biggest exporter of services in the world. We're second. The US just beats us.
And if we don't get a full all-singing, all-dancing deal done with India, what about India as a potential target for services agreements?
I think India we would have to consider for a longer period of time. I think India, even in terms of delivering an FTA, I would say is a high-risk, high-reward country to deliver an FTA with. It does look like it's growing over the next 30 years or so. It does look like there's a lot of complementarities with the types of things that we like to export, that India has to export. But I do think that there are some important things, for example, labour rights enforcement, that we should be really on the front foot about. Even in the UK, we could improve some of the ways that we enforce our labour rights. And so thinking about that from an India perspective will also be important.
Mark Borsey.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if I could ask Catherine, just sticking with this theme about playing to strengths. Do you think the UK knows what its strengths are? And if it does know what its strengths are, should it, through other policy directives, for example, the Advanced Manufacturing Plan, should that inform our trade policy?
First, I want to just say something about services, because it is our strength, and it's an area. I came out of the financial service industry. I know about trade because that's where I was. We do 4 times as much service trade with the United States as we do with our second biggest customer, which is Ireland. So, and we've done all of that without a trade agreement with the United States. The key thing with services is having a common language, a common accounting system, a common legal system, and a common financial service system. Selling services into India is probably good because they do use English as one of their official languages. They have adopted our legal and accounting system to a degree. But they also already have, right now, a lot of UK services are using call centres in India. So we're already using them, and they're already providing us with a service, if you like, rather than us supplying them with a service.
Do you think we sometimes forget about services because it's not a box or something that somebody can be photographed with? It's not tangible.
Does
it get left on the shelf?
Yeah, and sometimes I think the service industry is like that because the less government is involved, the better that is. I mean, you'd be amazed how often I have rebutted things written by the Financial Times and even the Resolution Foundation, which just talks about trade as if it's goods. And our biggest export sector is a service sector now. We are selling more what they call other business services, which is legal and accounting services, than we are our transport and machinery sector, which is lumping together both cars and planes, which is what we do in terms of machinery.
Should our policy then have a much more service focus than it has right now?
I'm not sure what policy you would put in place. The exports really happen by having really good companies. And you get really good companies first nationally. There was talk in the last session about SMEs. Most SMEs are catering to a local environment and they're happy doing so. Very few want to become multinationals. But things like Starbucks and McDonald's started with Starbucks started with one coffee shop in San Francisco. McDonald's started with one hamburger joint in Chicago. And first they became national companies long before they became international companies. And it's very good for people to talk about SMEs, but you have to drill down and say, what are these companies? What are they making? Could they possibly export? I mean, my local hairdresser is fantastic, but he can't export. You know, he's not in the business. He's not interested. He's full all the time. You know, and that is a lot of our SMEs.
Sure, but there may be a business manufacturing a product on an industrial estate that doesn't know about the opportunities for export in a way that the hairdresser never will. So, do they know about? Do we communicate with those SMEs because it is easier for them to grow their business, given the existing method, the new methods of logistics, to get those goods out there in a way that was not the case perhaps 10 or 20 years ago?
Actually, I think it's easier for people to get goods out there than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And usually it's, the trouble is the UK has quite a big population and most SMEs can survive quite well just selling to the UK population. You often find a lot of multinationals start in very small countries with a small population, so something like IKEA started in Sweden, but to get big they had to get international because the Swedish population wasn't big enough to grow and really get the benefits of economy of scale. And that is where you've got to look at, do they want to do that? And why are companies not doing that? For things like machinery, you need cheap energy. China didn't become the major supplier of a lot of parts and machinery because it had a lot of green rules that made their energy expensive. They made their energy cheap. They have a labour structure that probably wouldn't go down well in the UK. They have a lot of things that has made companies move their production line to China. Interestingly, now a lot of that production is moving to the Philippines and Indonesia. So it's not a one-way street.
Right, so you're making a strong case for the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but...
No, I'm not actually. No, I say that is in fact wrong. The one we've proposed isn't the same as the EU's. We've included 2 products, which I have no idea why. And also, we actually closed our last fertiliser production facility 2 years ago in the UK. All the fertiliser here we're importing. Why we've decided to put a tax on that is insane. You can't drive industry...
You said earlier, focus on what you're good at, play to your strengths. If it's not making fertiliser, it's not making fertiliser, and we import it.
No. Well, it's not making fertiliser because we've made our oil and gas very expensive and difficult. But at the same time, if you need to import it, don't put a tax on it. Because I would also suggest, right now we have temporarily taken off the tariffs on orange juice, almonds, tofu, a whole lot of things that we don't really make here. And you wonder, why did we ever have tariffs on those things anyhow? We have to work out what we need to import and take the tariffs off, and what we can export, and then encourage those businesses first to become national.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Good that we're encouraging tofu eating, I think, with the reduction in tariffs. Ian Lavery.
On the 11th of April, the UK unilaterally suspended tariffs on 126 goods, and that included car parts and fruit juice. And I think, Catherine, you've actually praised the work and praised the decision to unilaterally suspend it. What do you think is a further scope to go a lot further than this? Or?
Well, I think that first, this is a 2-year suspension, and for big companies to move their supply chains, they probably want to know that this is going to be a continuing suspension, because you're not going to go to a lot of trouble to start importing something from a new, it's temporarily suspended, if in 2 years' time you're going to have to go back to your old supplier and say, oh, sorry about that, you're now cheaper than the people in Brazil, so I'm going to go back to you. So I would like it to be permanent, but then there are a lot of other things we don't make that they didn't take the tariffs off. Because the reason the tariffs were taken off these products is they actually did a consultation and asked companies to give them a list of tariffs they wanted removed. And some of the companies that applied were not even UK companies. A Dutch flour transporter was one of the people who applied to get the tariffs taken off cut flours, which was interesting because we don't have a lot of tariffs on cut flours because most of the countries that supply them are already under one of the many trade agreements we have. But 1 or 2 things probably in the back of the truck somewhere, there's some dried flowers from China or something, so that they applied to get those cut, so they've now been all cut, which will be much quicker for those pantechnicons to bring flowers in from the Dutch market. But there are, the coconut oil, rice flour, there were literally millions of tariffs that I go through every time I have to scrutinise a trade deal. That we really don't need to have. There is no point in us putting tariffs on rice. We don't grow rice. We've never been able to grow rice. We don't have tariffs on soybeans because we can't grow them. We don't have tariffs on corn because we don't grow it. But for some reason we have a tariff on rice even though we can't grow it. And
you see, that basically what you're saying is there's much more scope, lots and lots and lots of scope for further unilateral liberalisation of the trade by the UK in so many words. Lots of them. And usually the trade process that we picked up from the EU was to try and bring in tariff-free raw materials, generally, except for rice and a few others, and then keep the higher value development in the EU.
that doesn't work for us now that we've left, because often that higher development wasn't happening in the UK. So there's no reason for us to continue to protect the coffee roasters of Germany or the starch processors in Poland or whatever. You know, we're not doing it ourselves, so why not let the people of Brazil or the people of India or wherever do that processing, because it helps them move up the value chain. They get to move from growing the raw materials to grinding them or refining them, and it also means it's cheaper transport. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, transporting things halfway around the world is, you know, silly, but you're going, well, then let them do the development and process, just send us the end product.
I think that's fine.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, Emily, the UK has kept protectionist measures with agri-food products, while Australia has done the exact opposite. What should we learn from Australia? And Catherine, you said earlier on, agriculture is not what we do, but I've got a few farmers in Loughborough who disagree with you. Do you mean that we should just try to satisfy our domestic market with our own production? And if so, what would the impact be on other export sectors, please? Emily.
I think what's interesting when you look at some of the modelling around what happens when you put trade barriers in place is that sometimes it's a little unexpected. So earlier we talked about fisheries in the UK, and so the modelling that we did kind of around the EU deal around the TCA suggested that fishing output would shrink quite substantially in the UK as we shrink the size of the export market that the UK has access to. Meanwhile, because on the agricultural side of things, we expected actually agriculture might grow, and that's because the import restrictions from the EU meant that there was less domestic competition in the UK. So I think sometimes the ways that actually trade can manifest around the different types of liberalisation that you do can be a little bit nuanced. But I did want to draw attention to kind of non-tariff barriers, which I think are increasingly important in trade. So often now when traders are talking about the issues that they're facing, they're talking about these behind the border or at the border barriers. So things like checks on imports, the types of documentation that you need to bring when you're delivering exports or imports to various places, when you're thinking about the regulatory regimes that you need to agree to or not agree to. And so I think that's where we should kind of maybe focus our efforts on thinking through how do we resolve some of those at and behind the border barriers. I think, you know, it's encouraging to see that the UK's target border operating model, but I think it could, a lot more would need to be done to actually significantly kind of reduce those at the border and behind the border barriers, which are actually quite a lot bigger than some of the tariffs that we do put in place.
What one thing could we do to resolve that, do you think? What's the number one priority to resolve the border issue?
I think there's some things that we can do domestically that don't require kind of collaboration, and then I think a lot is kind of international collaboration. And so one thing that we've talked about in our research is looking to other countries that have a similar relationship between the UK and the EU that we do. So Canada and the US, or Australia and New Zealand, where they do have quite deep arrangements where they look across different regulations and decide, you know, are we happy to go to agree on these types of regulations? Do we agree with your approach? And therefore, are we happy to secure the same regulations in particular areas? It doesn't necessarily apply to all areas, and there are carve-outs, which I also think is very important. But I think if we are looking for kind of a macroeconomic impact on goods trade, then we do have to look to kind of much bigger policy plans, and the only way really to remove those at the border and the behind the border checks are to consider things like customs unions and kind of single market for goods. So I think that there are some things that you can do, but I think that to have these macroeconomic impacts is pretty challenging.
Okay, thank you very much, Emily. Catherine, what about my farmers?
Well, I actually bought these things with you because it intrigues me. You probably know I'm on the Trade and Agriculture Commission, which means I have to read the trade deals. And I read Chapter 2 because I have to go through and predict what we'll buy, what we won't buy. And when people say that farmers aren't protected, you want to wave Chapter 2 of the Australia deal and Chapter 2 of the New Zealand deal at them and force them to read it. Because the only industry we have protected to the detriment of consumers in the UK are farmers.
Right.
And if you look through another thing which I didn't bring you, which is a fantastic document, it's called Farm Income, and they DEFRA produce it every year, and you can see that some of our farmers are brilliant. You know, our dairy farmers are fantastic, and we have exported milk every year for as long as I've got records for. We produce enough to supply UK demand and enough to export. The really unfortunate thing is we export it to Ireland, where they make it into butter and cheese and sell it back to us at like 5 times the price that we sent them the milk. So what I would like to see in our farming sector is to actually go up the value chain ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, there are things that we're not doing because we always relied on someone else to do that. And that doesn't make sense anymore. But other farmers have just never got with the program, and I suspect it's a lot to do with the way the subsidies were handed out, which were based on land rather than on production. Right. And there are a lot of people, because of a tax advantage, it's not affected by an inheritance tax, nor do you get affected by stamp duty. So a lot of people who are not farmers invest in farmland. And so it's driven up the price of farmland to a point where real farmers can't afford to run farms. And that's sort of part of our problem. So it's not that our farming isn't what we do, it's exporting of agricultural products isn't what we do. If you look at the proportion, like beef exports, for instance, 0.07% of our exports. You know, both beef and dairy exports make up about half of 1% of our exports, and beef is about a quarter of all of the meat that we export. And most of what we export are the offcuts that we don't eat ourselves. And there is another very good group that I would really suggest you talk to, which is the International Meat Trade Association. And they run through, you know, the cuts. We are exporting beef shins because we don't really eat beef shins, but there are countries that do, you know, and that liver, you know, kidney, tongues, tripe, all of that stuff we're exporting. We're keeping the prime cuts, we're eating the fillet steak ourselves. You know, so when people talk about exports of beef, they're usually talking about exporting the leftovers, if you like. You know, we're a very affluent nation. We can afford to eat this, and a lot of the people we're trading with are less affluent, and they are eating what we would put in the garbage, you know, and that's something you've got to consider. It's not all, you know, one big block, you know, and...
I've got a lot of ground to cover in 7 minutes, so I'm going to just... Can I just check on border target operating model? We've got an estimate of £330 million worth of costs. Is that a good cost to impose on UK consumers, and could the cost actually be higher?
I haven't. Is this for? I haven't myself looked into kind of specific figures around it. I think what's important to note is that the UK implemented its import barriers on day one when the UK exited the EU. So we do have. The EU did. Sorry. Yes. Sorry. Yes. The EU implemented its import barriers on day one when we exited the EU. So I think that we have this asymmetry between the UK's import barriers and the EU's import barriers at the moment. So I think it's not wrong for the government to look to kind of introduce import barriers over time. I do think you're right that, you know, having import barriers does have a cost to consumers. I'm not sure kind of what that cost will look like, but yeah.
There's going to be a cost to UK consumers?
I would expect so from applying import barriers, yeah.
Could I answer to that question?
Yes.
The cost has been costed by Julian Jessup. It is very, very low, and but also it's based on the idea that we continue to import things from the EU, because this is people looking at food coming across the channel. If you start lowering the tariffs on other countries who can produce food more cheaply, and those are countries that have been always been checked at the border, you may find that the cost actually goes down. So it's only if you retain what we've been doing forever and add cost to it, then costs will go up, though Julian says is very, very small. But if you actually drop your tariffs on non-EU producers, and I recommend you do because they're all a lot cheaper. The EU is not known for its cheap food. And even now when people say, we rely on so much food from the EU, they're using value rather than volume. And it's because we're paying over the top for EU food that it looks like we're importing a lot and we rely on them for our food. We don't. Okay. So, you drop the tariffs, you don't have to worry so much about the cost.
Thank you. Douglas.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Did you have a...
No, it's just interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Douglas. Yeah, come on.
Just on the, I think the question is to Emily. The Resolution Foundation published figures last year regarding the obvious impact of Brexit on goods trade, and I think we've looked at OBR figures as well. We just wondered how much is that actually the drop in trade actually down to Brexit? Have you done any further investigation into that? And what did the figures reveal in terms of the service sector in particular that might be more optimistic?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I think the key question when we're looking at how trade is performing in the UK is, how is it performing? Are we up? Are we down? Are we about the same? And so I think what you can see from the services trade is that the UK has been growing in both imports and exports over the last 5 years. Meanwhile, if you turn to goods trade, we have reduced our goods trade quite substantially. So we're now about the same level in volume terms of goods trade that we were back in 2015. So this is definitely a reduction in goods trade. Now, we might say that's fine, and we're happy to have a reduction in goods trade. We might be fine with that in particular because other countries might have been experiencing similar things. We all know that there's been massive global shocks around the pandemic and the energy crisis, which have also impacted trade. But what we see from other countries that are similar to us, so if we look at the OECD, if we look at the G7, their goods trade has been increasing over time while our goods trade has been shrinking. But our exports and imports are by far the weakest across the G7, which is our kind of preferred group of countries to compare to. But if you look at, there's also more sophisticated ways to do this. You can look at synthetic models, which use pre-Brexit referendum trends to align what the UK's goods trade looked like before the Brexit referendum happened. And you can see from that the UK is really underperforming where you would have expected the UK's goods volumes to be.
Right. And is there any evidence to suggest that when we're dealing with exports, that we should be looking at the issue regarding proximity of countries? Is it easier to actually trade with Germany than Guatemala, Belgium rather than Bolivia? Because as far as I can see, a lot of the trade deals that have already been struck are of relatively low value compared with if it been still within the European Union.
Yes, and I think that the majority, still, or about half of our goods trade is with the EU, and you do see that that's a lower number for services, and you might argue that that's because for goods trade, you really need to be transporting those goods. If we're talking about things like food manufacturing, you don't want to have a mouldy pizza delivered to you. You really want to have a fresh pizza, so it really matters that it's close. It also matters for things like supply chains. So if you want to do just-in-time supply chains, if you want to import parts for, say, cars, and then convert those cars into a final product or into a more advanced product, export them again back to, say, Germany, then you do really need to have that kind of proximity. And there is a large body of research which suggests that distances do matter for goods trade, also for services trade, although slightly less.
Catherine, just on a slightly different tack, I know you take a different view from
I'm just going to tell you that our trade is with people with wealthy countries. It doesn't matter if it's Germany or if it's America. You know, it's actually, of the 27 countries in the EU, we only trade with 9 of them, and they're the rich 9, and they were mainly already members when we joined. They all joined with us. All of the new members hardly buy anything from us. 90% of our exports with the EU just go to the rich countries. And if you look at all the other rich countries in the world, Japan, Korea, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, that's who we sell to. It's nothing to do with distance. It's actually cheaper to transport stuff on a boat than it is by road, 12 times cheaper. So, you know, it's nothing to do with distance. It is everything to do with can they afford the stuff that we sell.
And just on the other, I know we're running out of time, Chair, but just to say, just on the issue we've discussed earlier about things like having a proper trade strategy, do you feel that that is something that is missing from the toolbox of what the UK should be looking at in terms of boosting our trade? If we're looking for sort of easier, smarter ways of doing trade, looking at a more pragmatic, focused trade policy or trade strategy, is that something we should be looking at seriously, or can we just bumble along the way we're doing at the moment in terms of the odd trade deal here or whatever, and try and work our way through that?
The best trade deal things we can do as a strategy is to unilaterally drop our tariffs, especially on stuff we don't make or can't make in a sufficient quantity. Things like parts actually come from China and Mexico. They're not coming from the EU. The EU, like us, is a car assembly plant these days. They're not actually manufacturing the bits. The other thing we should do is trade deals wherever possible. But you've got to help your companies become good companies in the UK. We've got to look at how we're taxing them. We're going to look at how we're making the things they need more expensive, such as electricity. Our electricity, our commercial electricity, not the retail, is more expensive than France and Germany, and it's about 3 times more expensive than the US.
Would that sit well with an industrial policy that looks at things like skills and costs and productivity as
Definitely, well? Yes. Well, that's because you won't become a good export company unless you're a good national company, and we're making it very difficult for companies to remain in the UK. And we've got to look at that, and I would suggest we start with the energy costs, because we are lumbering onto our businesses an energy cost that the French and the Germans are not doing. And that extra network cost makes all the difference. I did write a paper about steel on this, and I did put a graph on how they differ. And so you can't expect to be a big exporter if you're strangling the company at birth, which we have done,
Okay, we're slightly over time, but we've just got a couple more questions, Mark.
Yeah, I just want to pick up the point that Emily made about regulatory alignment. And you said that Canada has got arrangements with the US, New Zealand with Australia. We did have regulatory alignment with the EU, particularly to take advantage of just-in-time supply chains. I know, Catherine, you said that many of the components came outside of the EU, but there's an awful lot being made in Slovakia and other such countries that were coming into the UK to be assembled in UK automotive. So is there anything we can learn from those other countries? And my impression is we've made it harder to get goods into the UK and out of the UK because we've tightened up on declarations. We need to undo those, don't we, to have any significant impact?
I think one clear way to think about this is when we're coming up with regulatory strategies and plans is to think about kind of a cost-benefit analysis of is this going to benefit us more to have our own regulation in this area, or is it going to benefit more to...
Absolutely. I visited a car plant where they were manufacturing product for the US and for the European market, including the UK at that time. And I asked the car manufacturer, I said, well, now once we're out of the EU, you'll be able to make a third variety of car, which will be made to a UK specification rather than an EU specification. And the car manufacturer looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, the UK will get the same car as the EU. So there is alignment, isn't there, anyway?
I think in some areas there's alignment. Sometimes there's kind of passive divergence as well as the UK kind of makes domestic decisions. So I think we need to be kind of conscious of that. Obviously, as time goes by, there's more likely to be some passive or active divergence from EU regulation, and so it is something that's worth us kind of considering now, as we are kind of relatively close to what the EU's doing.
And if we continue to do stuff in the same way as the EU did, where's our Brexit freedom?
So I think to your point on kind of, do you want to build a wing mirror that's 1 centimetre kind of bigger or smaller than your largest trading partner of wing mirrors? I think the obvious question is you probably don't want to build a wing mirror that's different. But I think what can be beneficial from having kind of much more formalised kind of regulatory discussions is that you are able to shape what those discussions are much more actively. So in the case of the US and Canada, both parties are kind of shaping those discussions and deciding what areas should be aligned and what shouldn't be aligned.
Okay, thanks, Jen.
Could I just answer that really quickly?
Briefly, because we're over time. Yeah.
Just on the car industry, we make over 1 million cars last year. Only 20% of them were for the UK market. 80% of the cars we make are exported. 60% of the value of the cars we export do not go to the EU. They go all around the world. This idea that the EU is our largest market is just rubbish, okay? And the cars we sell, 60%
Catherine,
by
would you
volume...
mind if I just sort of bring us into Annie MacDonald, who's going to ask our last question?
I just wanted to put it to Emily that it's been put to us that rejoining the single market would be the most effective way of stopping the rot. Do you agree with that? Of rejoining the single market? Would you think that is going to be an effective way of addressing some of the deficits that we discussed today in terms of the figures you quoted since 2015?
I think it's a strategic decision for the UK, and I think the UK needs to decide whether we want to have a macroeconomic benefit from that trading relationship. I think we wouldn't want to consider kind of necessarily joining the single market for services, which would obviously require freedom of movement of people. But I think if you think about things like the single market for goods and some of the regulatory alignment pieces that we've been discussing today, then that is something that we could consider.
Could I just say that the drop in exports of goods is nothing to do with Brexit. It is 100% to do with the fact that our largest trading partners, many of which are in the EU, are in a recession at the moment, so they are not buying as many goods. And if you look at their trade statistics, you will discover that they're in exactly the same boat. This idea that we can magic our way back to 2015 by rejoining the single market is not true. The single market is in a massive hole which is going to get worse, and we are well out of it. And and actually, our machinery and transport, which are our biggest sectors, were both up by 9%, both imports and exports last year, both to EU and non-EU countries. So it's not true. They like to mash all these figures together and try and create but if you actually look down at the individual things, you'll see that it's not as bad as it looks.
There is a conflict in the evidence, that's right.
That will conclude our panel. We're slightly out of time. Thank you so much indeed for your evidence and for your time today. That is hugely appreciated. That concludes this panel and this session this morning. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.